Hi, welcome to a new Art Talk. This short series is produced by Artifier in partnership with Partial and Culture Fancier. In today's episode, we'll have a conversation with Ibrahim Abusitta, a Palestinian-Canadian interdisciplinary visual artist that works and lives in Toronto. Let's begin. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am thrilled to be having this conversation with you. I feel like we've been following each other for a long time, but we have not really had the time to talk about your work. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
How did you start your career in the arts, and what inspires you?
In my 20s, someone asked me what would I do if I wasn't working in hotels, which is what I did before I went to art school. And the only thing I could think of was, making art, but I had no background in the arts whatsoever. I didn't really take it in school or do any extracurricular activities. I lived in Mississauga before Toronto, and before that I lived in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. That's where I was born and raised.
Okay.
And I moved to Canada when I was a teenager.
Do you see a difference in between, how the arts, world works in one part of the world and the other?
In Saudi Arabia, there's no art world. Maybe now there's a little more things happening there, and other parts of the Middle East, like in the Emirates, for example, or in Qatar, or definitely, most of the countries in the Middle East do have some kind of art scene, but Saudi Arabia is really not one of those places. And I didn't necessarily have a family that, was into the arts themselves, so whenever we went to a museum, that was more of a touristy thing to do when we went to a new city. But we did it at the very minimal level, So the arts was kind of a tricky thing growing up. It wasn't there in my life all the time, but I enjoyed those moments on my own where I would draw, like most kids, just give them a pen and paper and they're kind of happy. And when I was 13, my aunt noticed how much I was drawing and decided that I should have a sketchbook. Before that, I would just random paper, I would rip out of a notebook and just draw and then kind of lose. So there was a bit of recognition. It didn't come from my direct family right away. They thought it was interesting, but never really wanted to dig deep and invest into it or see if I needed to, go in some kind of classes for it or whatever.
Tell us about your work. What subjects are you interested in?
I tend to do a lot of figurative work now. I started out doing a lot of still life, and that's for painting. In the beginning, I started doing things with photography. That's what I went to OCAD for. I did a photo major, and I did a lot of self-portraiture, identity work. That kind of seemed what the institutions lean towards. They like the conceptual work. It doesn't have to be just aesthetics. The imagery, I don't know. There's definitely a lot of research for the images that I've made based off for my figurative works. And as basic as it is, I find it fine to Google my images, for example, versus finding it in a unique book that's first edition from a certain generation, right, or whatever. I don't put so much stock or value into where the imagery comes from because we're such an image-heavy society. Has
your practice changed since this lockdown began?
No, it hasn't really changed too much. My studio and my studio mates, in the beginning we definitely slowed down. We didn't go to the studio when it was real lockdown, just essentials. And my life has changed definitely like everyone else's. I do a lot of freelance work. That's kind of how I support my art practice. Luckily, my one client has been able to continue their business during the pandemic and been able to have me at their space because when I do my photo work, I can be on my own, independent, right, in the basement, away from everyone. So I was able to work throughout the pandemic, which is really amazing. I feel very lucky. And there was definitely a period where I couldn't make paintings because emotionally, mentally, I wasn't there. And there's this whole what's the point? This is not important right now. until it seems like we kind of started to have more awareness of what's kind of happening on a grand scale, and everyone sort of started getting back to their normality, whatever it is. But the mental health part was definitely like, everyone was experiencing
sure.
it. You can even feel it on Instagram, which is like one of the biggest platforms that I share my work with others. And now I feel like I'm literally back to where I was before, except with all these new sort of amendments and, not seeing as many people in person.
Right.
But the communication and the actual work, like I'm going into the studio any day. I'm not shooting for a client.
Earlier this year, you shared a post with a little graph, just like a representation of, what the galleries were doing, like in terms of representing diverse artists. And I think it really started a conversation here in Toronto.
I learned a lot of things from that post, before that post, after. I mean, this whole period has been a sort of analysis of what we do individually.
Right.
Like we're all witnesses to so many things that are wrong with your local scene, the international scene, wherever you are, that there's a lot of injustices. So for me, I felt like I had to do something, and I was actually in my studio, not able to paint, but figured, okay, I can do this, and I actually spent hours pulling up, and I explained this in like an article that I wrote for Canadian Art Magazine, which is, I am not a scientific person. I have no idea if the way I approached this was the proper way you would do this kind of survey. The dialogue was bizarre. If you go to any comments on any of these posts that people have been posting, you know what I'm talking about.
Like I reposted the post, the square, and I do. I can tell you that I saw that part of the conversation happening, right?
Yeah. And some people were doing the whole, just innocent bystander, where it's like, I don't see anything wrong with this, or what's wrong with someone doing this, or, some people were trying to place these arguments of, to make sense of it. Here's why. And it's like people were getting away from the actual issue of there's a problem here.
But the good thing about this is that it just puts the subject on the table, so people can start, thinking about it. What are you doing to keep you creating?
I've been spending as much of the free time during this spring-summer period going to parks and bird watching. So that inspires me. That it's doing something outside of the whole thing, but also something beautiful to witness. Birding inspires me to then have a sense that I can go back to the studio and sort of create. It has nothing to do with the other, but it's more of I think it's just like the mentality of the whole thing.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And if people want to know more about your work, where can they find you?
You can find me on the internet, on Instagram, and then are we gonna do a handle here?
Yes, we will.
Insert handle here. It's my Ibrahim.Abusitta.
Okay.
We'll put a thing, right?
Okay, we will.
So goofy. You can find me there. In the city, if people want to do a studio visit, even though it's safe distance times. I have a couple of shows coming up. There's one that's at the end of this week. 2020 has been very weak for actual works in public.
Right.
But there's 2 shows happening before the end of this year, and then the rest of it is just online in my studio. That's where you'll find me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this chat. I appreciate it, and hope you're safe, and then we'll keep following you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for our next episode and say hi if you find us on Instagram. See you next week.